And I'm filling in, sort of, for Pastor Kurt today. I normally sing with the worship team, but since I was switched to working second shift at Palmer Johnson Yachts recently, can't make it to Wednesday night practice. So, Kurt says I can't sing on Sunday. So I said, well, how about if I preach? That doesn't take any practice. He didn't really like that, but so I told him, well, I made this pulpit. If you don't let me preach, I'll just take it apart. So it kind of falls apart anyway. Oh yeah, and Kurt forgot to tell you last week, no heckling from those seats, especially over there. So we'll be reading about Paul's visit to Athens from Acts 17. If you want to go there right now in a minute. But first I want to just ask if everyone here has met my friend Brian Blue. No? Well, he said I could mention his name today as long as I didn't point. But Brian is the good-looking guy sitting back there in front of the sound booth and behind that big mustache. Say hi, Brian. Say hi, Brian's mustache. Brian and I met at the shipyard a couple of years ago, and he's been coming here about a year now. And it's been my pleasure to introduce him to the friends I have here. You know the drill. I say, so-and-so, this is Brian. Brian, this is so-and-so. Then I supervise a handshake, and I mention the mustache. And I maybe talk about Brian's devotion and determination to learn all he can about his faith, and about our Savior, Jesus Christ. He has become a good friend of mine. Besides all that, my wife says he's sweet, whatever that means. I say all that not just to embarrass Brian or get myself in trouble, but because today's reading is all about a biblical introduction. We will hear of Paul's approach to introducing the supposed seekers of Athens to God. Let's read that together from Acts 17, 16 to 28. While Paul was waiting for Silas and Timothy in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day, with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with Paul. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting with Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands, as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being." It was not just my pleasure to introduce my friends to Brian, but something of an obligation, as the one knowing both parties. I was the bridge between Brian and my family here. Paul shows us how to be the bridge between our God and everyone we happen to know. The first step is to care. When I told my son Josh what chapter I was going to speak from today, he said that verse 16, the first verse, in what we read today, was one of his favorite Bible verses, and that it reveals how Paul was open to the moving of the Holy Spirit and prompted to open his mouth and speak the truth of God. Paul cared. So he went right to the synagogue, where he began first to reason with the Jews, his own people. There were no cultural or religious barriers there that he had to climb over. He only had to convince them that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. He also talked with God-fearing Greeks. We might say that while these men were not familiar with the fall of man or God's plan for redemption as the Israelites knew all about all that stuff, they had at least been honest enough to recognize their own sin and fear that one day they would be held accountable and face a judgment day. Ultimately, Paul began to reason with everyone in the literal marketplace, it says, dealing with whatever mixed bag of beliefs and backgrounds he encountered, but always reasoning. This sounds so much like the context I think with people on Facebook. Mixed bag. All of this exposure led to an invitation to the famed Areopagus, which means hill of Ares, who was the Greek god of thunder and war. The deep thinkers of the day wanted Paul to come in and entertain them for a while with his newfangled ideas and claims about God. The Epicureans, which you might say had devolved into a kind of a free love group, and the Stoics, who were kind of like the ultimate queens. Everything is good unless it makes you smile. Then it must be bad. They love to get together and fight over ideas. Whatever the case we encounter in our lives, whatever the position or wavering positions our friends may favor, our calling is, as Paul's, to open up and reason with people we meet in order to bless them with the truth of God's love and the gift of salvation by grace. So what did Paul do when given the floor in the Areopagus? He started with his new familiarity with Athens and quickly turned to introducing God. That's how this passage strikes me. And that's why I went through all that preamble about introducing Brian and his famous mustache. Paul was like Athens. Paul was like, Athens, meet God. God, meet Athens. He doesn't need to tell God anything about the Athenians. But what did he tell these philosophers about God? The answer might suggest a pattern for us to follow. Verse 24, the first thing he mentions, God made the world. This is a great starting point. I think it's basic and essential. And in our day and age, it is always quite controversial and even in your face. Well, I say so be it. If we let go of the foundation, the first thing that God wanted us to know about himself in Genesis 1:1, then what will the rest of your description of God include? Is there anything else that would not offend or cause an affront to your friends? What else did God make? Oh yeah, everything in it. It says a lot that God created the whole planet, but even more, that he made everything in it, Paul tells us. But what about this pulpit? Did I make the pulpit? Or the $200 million yacht I've been working on lately? Let's look at John 1:3. Through him, it says, all things were made. It doesn't mean just nature, the natural world. Because John goes on, without him, nothing is made that has been made. John uses the double negative to form a positive, and to answer arrogant questions about pulpits and yachts. To make this pulpit, I had to have many things provided for me. Plans, design, lumber, hardware, some intelligence, strength, even tools, which represent the work of many others. And ultimately, it's all because of God's creative genius and his principles that he provides. Paul continues describing God to the Athenians. He is Lord of heaven and earth. Verse 24 again. Lordship means ownership and authority over. As in, personally, I am the Lord of a 1996 Ford Rusty Explorer. Turn to Deuteronomy 10:14 and see if God can beat that. Here we read, to the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything in it. Not only did he make it, but he claims ownership of everything. The Greeks certainly would have understood it, that Paul was saying God owns even the Areopagus, the Acropolis down the street, all of Greece, the seas, the lands across the seas, and all that they had ever seen or heard about. And as for us, what prideful claims of ownership we or our friends might make, houses or cars or power tools or hand toys or patents or copyrights or mustaches or kids or even grandkids. It all belongs to Him. Paul goes on. He does not live in temples built by hands. You cannot contain God in any way. There's nothing you can do to inhibit His efforts or stifle His plans. Except in that we can refuse His good grace and reject His salvation and forsake the chance to be His disciple. That's about it. And He is not served by human hands as if He needed anything. What can I do to meet God's needs? Nothing. I remember once, when I was a kid growing up in the Catholic Church, I heard someone talk about sacrifices and how we need to make sacrifices. So I went into the bathroom and turned the hot water on in the bathtub. Full blast, just hot. No, I did not stick my face in the scalding water, but I leaned over, trying to hurt myself a little bit with the steam. Well, too bad for God, it didn't really hurt at all. And I just ended up getting a smooth skin of a steam bath, along with my soothed conscience. It's a good thing that God does not need for all of my efforts for anything. Paul goes on and explains, he says, because He Himself, God does not need anything, because He Himself gives all men life and breath. If He didn't, where else did these things come from? Blind chance? Even the world's desperate and merely asserted answer of evolution violates a long-held scientific principle. The law of biogenesis declares that life comes from life. What else did God give, it says? Everything else. Life and breath are nice. I use mine every day. But what is this everything else? Let's see if we can name a few things that fall into this category. Can anybody name anything, any noun, besides life and breath? There are no wrong answers. Come on, Matt. Name anything. Anything that God made. Guitar. God designed all the principles behind guitar. Anything else? That's it?
Love.
Love. That's a good one. Is that Tiffany? Oh. Victoria. That was Tiffany because it's your anniversary weekend. I thought you were thinking about that. What about gravity? Where would we be without it? Everywhere, or anywhere, nowhere. My favorite scientific principle is precession. Who knows what precession is? That's the thing that makes a top keep spinning. It doesn't fall over because precession won't allow a rotating object to change its position very well. Same thing makes a frisbee work. Did you ever try throwing a frisbee without spinning it? It has to spin. It's the precession that keeps it level. And then there's friction. Without friction, we could go nowhere. We could not walk or drive a car or steer or brake a bike without friction. There is no natural explanation for these basic elements that we enjoy every day. Paul continues with his description or introduction of God. From one man, He made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and He determined the times set for them, and the exact places where they should live. This one surprised me. It doesn't really seem like a basic element of God's nature, as the other points do. But it does tell us about what God does for a living, you might say. It seems to be an essential element of any good introduction to say what someone does for a living. And this seems to entail the whole nature of all things political in the history of all mankind. Next, Paul explains why God set up the earth and determined the boundaries the way he does. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. This is the answer to the big why question that we often ask about world events. Has anybody noticed anything about borders in the news lately, as Steve was referring to? Ukraine, Russia, Gaza, Israel, Mexico, United States. But this description of God's work by Paul offers great comfort. We are assured that God is in control, and that while people everywhere undergo turmoil and fear as borders are attacked and broken, God's purpose is that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. The ultimate greater good. Though in a corrupted world, misery is inevitable, peace and calm can overcome as more and more people find God and follow him. I think the final application of all that Paul has said so far, and what we might share with seeking friends, is found in verse 28. And strangely enough, he does not quote a Hebrew prophet of old, or one of the patriarchs of Israel, but a semi-mythical philosopher from Crete who had lived 600 years before Paul. His name was Epimenides, and he's quoted as saying about a theoretical God that in him we live and move and have our being. Paul doesn't quote Epimenides because he was famous and would appeal to the Athenians, but because Epimenides was well known and correct. The fact that the Holy Spirit included a quote from Epimenides in the Scripture in this context, I think demonstrates that it's correct. In him we live. Can I have a volunteer again? Someone to show us living in him? Just sit there and live in him. Greg, you're doing a good job. Thank you. That was a good example. We live in him. It's not like there is God up on his throne and he might choose to look down and see me when he happens to turn my way, or if I'm not behind a tree. But rather, you and I live in him. God not only sees me right now as from afar, but also as from up close, and from every angle. He's thoroughly familiar with every aspect of each of us. He can discern a glint of truth in my eye, or the wink of a falsehood that might be hidden there. He knows intimately if my heart or your heart is turned toward him just now, or if it is even slightly focused inward and selfish. With the way I live out each minute at work or at home, God's Spirit is either pleasantly impacted and approving, or grieved and disappointed. This is who God is and how he is with us. We live in him. In him we move. Anybody going to move? As an example of how we do it. I just saw 14 people look at their watches. But guess what? We are all always moving in him. We know God knows the number of hairs on our heads, but that almost seems like a passive tally God might take just once a month or so. But we are constantly moving and changing and adjusting, and he feels every twitch and jostle as much as we do. I cannot move a muscle without him being completely aware. Watch this little pantomime and tell me what I'm doing. What was that? Stealing something? Shoplifting? Pilfering? In him we move. He cannot help but to know and register and categorize and sort and file every motion you and I make. This is who God is. We move in him. And finally, In him we have our being. We need another volunteer. Bruce, could you show us having our being? What's that, Bruce? No. Not a can of beans. Not having our beans. Sit down, Bruce. Thank you. In him we have our being. Maybe this last phrase is a combination of our living and moving, but I think it's even more than that. I would say that this is your essence. And guess what? Your essence is inexorably tied up and connected to him. Now, these things are true of believers and non-believers. He envelops all of us. The difference is when a Christian, when a person gives themselves to the Lord, surrenders to his will. We are all tied up and connected to him. Yes, you have a free will that allows you to reject God's authority in your life. You may even deny that he exists and that Jesus Christ ever existed. But none of these options, these denials, really gives you the power to eliminate God from reality or somehow free you from being right there, accountable, and always in him. Someone may forsake God's potential impact of love and saving grace and spiritual gifts and fruits of the Spirit and even all fellowship with him and with his own. I don't know why someone would give up all that. But the very being that you have, the one and only being that you are, is still and only in him. There's only one more element about God that Paul introduced at the Areopagus that day. Almost as an afterthought, he refers to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is indeed a critical event in all of history, but that's because it affects the most critical day for each of us, which is what Paul emphasizes in this introduction to God, when he tells them about the coming day when God will judge the world with justice. Verse 31. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. So what might you tell your friends about God by way of introduction? I like the last section from Epimenides. In him, our created bodies live and find provision. In him, our souls, our mind, emotions, and will encounter understanding and love and purpose. And best of all, in him, our own spirits find their home. And that's all I have today. Let's pray. Lord God, it's so good to be in you in each of these ways, to live in you, to move in you, to have my being in you. May this truth just permeate my life, minute by minute. So pleasing to you as my life touches yours. And for all of us here, in Jesus' name, amen. You're dismissed. Thanks for coming today.